Samsung and its affiliate companies produce around 1/5 of Korea's total exports, and their 2019 revenue represented roughly 13% of South Korea's GDP. It has become such an integral part of society that many Koreans today jokingly call their own country the Republic of Samsung. This video will tell the story of how Samsung went from a post-war trading company to an international technology giant, and where it might be heading in the future. The history of Samsung is big and complex, so this video was a collaboration with Asian Century Stocks, who do incredible work in the region. But let's get stuck in. Samsung was founded by B.C. Lee in 1938 as a Korean trucking business. It transported goods, fried fish, locally grown groceries, and noodles all across Korea. It would become one of the first family conglomerates in the country, or as they're known in Korea, chaebols. As time went on, B.C. Lee increasingly focused on securing key licenses and contracts from the government, as that's where the profits lied. Lee moved from Daegu to Seoul and formed a close relationship with Korea's post-war dictator, Ciggy, who ruled Korea from 1948 to 1961. One of the first government contracts that Samsung was awarded was a foreign currency recipient. It allowed Samsung to import raw materials such as wool and transform them into finished products like clothing. Samsung slowly became a diversified conglomerate. After woolen mills, BC turned to sugar refining. He used Samsung profits to acquire shares in a bank in 1957, an insurance company, a department store, and a university. From as early as the 1950s, BC Lee was reportedly the richest man in Korea. Management-wise, BC Lee prized lifelong loyalty to the company and took a very cautious approach to each new hire. He would sit in on almost every employee interview, which ended up being almost 100,000 interviews in total during his career. And Samsung became obsessed with cultivating lifetime generalists, so-called Samsung men. Over the next few decades, Samsung would develop a near military-style management approach with orders from the top down and a reluctance to challenge management. BC Lee was an almost godlike figure there, and he expected absolute devotion to the firm from his employees. When President Park Chung-hee took over Korea in a military coup in 1961, BC Lee saw an opportunity for new government contracts. President Park wanted to turn Korea into a modern manufacturing giant in order to compete with Japan. So he turned to his new friends such as Samsung to reach that goal. As a result, Samsung became a tool in building the domestic manufacturing industry. In the decades following, Samsung continued the conglomerate diversification and ventured into consumer electronics. In the early days, they tried to reverse engineer competitors' products, starting with black and white TV sets. But in 1974, Samsung's then CEO, J.K. Kang, received a phone call from a California entrepreneur known as Joseph Sudduth. He was a part owner of Korea Semiconductor, a new joint venture set up by him and a Korean businessman, but they had fallen on hard times, and Joseph wanted to get out. Could Samsung bail him out? This was the start of Samsung's foray into the semiconductor business. Internally, Samsung managers warned against the acquisition. They felt that chips were expensive to produce and risky, and they were competing with the best of the best. The Japanese companies had the full backing of the Japanese government, not an easy competitor. And during the first decade, Korea Semiconductor was a huge cash drain on Samsung. By then, BC Lee's third son, Lee Kun-hee, had gotten involved in the business, and he was wildly bullish on semiconductors and convinced his father that semis were the future. It would become one of Lee Kun-hee's greatest contributions to Samsung over the next few decades. In 1983, Samsung opened their first semiconductor fabrication plant, and the company built it in only 6 months, compared to the industry standard of 3 years. But foreign visitors to the plant at the time were not as impressed. It was located in the middle of a small town village, with farmers driving rice cultivators next to what was supposed to be a state-of-the-art semiconductor fab. But Samsung employees were relentless. They managed to get technology training from America's Micron, and while they were there, they tried to memorize every diagram they saw and recreate them back in the hotel room. Then, they gave gifts of pottery to Japanese executives at a competing manufacturer called PSC in exchange for the opportunity to buy their equipment. It took a lot of hustle to even get in the door. But in the 5 years from 1983 to 1988, Samsung went from one generation behind the Japanese in DRAM to only 6 months behind. Unfortunately though, in 1987, BC Lee would pass away, and after his death, Samsung was reorganised into 5 separate business groups. Samsung Group, which covered electronics, Shinsegae, which had retail, CJ Group, which had food, chemicals, entertainment and logistics, Hansol Group, which included paper and telecom, and the Jungang Group, which covered media. BC Lee's third-born son Lee Kun-hee, which we've already met, took over Samsung Group and would be instrumental in the transformation of Samsung to one of the world's largest business entities. But initially, people didn't have high hopes for him. He had originally wanted to be a film director and start a movie studio, but was dragged into the family business by his father. He was the typical 1980s playboy. He would drive his Porsche 911 at over 200 miles an hour on Samsung's private racetrack, but after a crash in the 80s, he was hurt so badly that he had to take opioids to ease the pain and was rumoured to be addicted to painkillers for many years. Early on, he wasn't much involved with Samsung. He spent most of his time at home where he lived a life of contemplation. He didn't even take calls from Samsung executives. So for the first few years as chairman, he barely came to the office. But in 1992, he realised that Samsung was in trouble. From the summer of 92 until that winter, I suffered from insomnia. I was feeling desperate, as though Samsung, beyond simply having to give up a business or two, might completely wither away. I never slept more than 4 hours in those days. Instead of my usual big appetite, which would only be satisfied with 3 portions of bulgogi, I barely managed to eat a meal a day. That year, I lost more than 10 kilograms. And his insomnia was not without reason. Samsung's quality control had deteriorated, revenues were decreasing, and their products had lost share in the important American market. Western expats in Korea jokingly called the company Samsuck, and Samsung products were widely ridiculed for their poor quality. But Lee Kun-hee's executives wouldn't tell him the truth. He was too far removed from the action to get to the bottom of Samsung's problems. So instead, he installed hidden cameras and microphones across Samsung offices and factory floors and was shocked at what he found. These investigations culminated in a corporate trip to Frankfurt. On the trip, he let it all out. He lashed out for days, telling them that they needed to change everything except their wives and children. He wanted designers to be creative, globally aware, and deliver profitable products. To reinforce his message that quality control had to be improved, he organised a massive bonfire where he threw in $50 million worth of sub-quality Samsung products to be burned while publicly shaming his executives. This infamous trip to Frankfurt later became known internally as the Frankfurt Declaration and was one of the key turning points in Samsung becoming a serious contender in the global consumer electronics industry. Lee called their new strategy Perpetual Crisis, and continuing the theme of Samsung's quasi-religious culture, they began distributing a book of proverbs called Change Begins With Me, Samsung's New Management. An executive called it Chairman Lee's Blue Book, a reference to Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, hinting that Samsung's new leadership style was not that different from Mao's in the 60s and 70s. It is hard to argue with the results though. The Frankfurt Declaration worked. Samsung enjoyed a great deal of success and in the following decades became the largest producer of memory chips in 1992 and 10 years later, the largest manufacturer of LCDs. Compared to other major Korean companies, Samsung survived the 1997 Asian financial crisis relatively unharmed. The only exception was their auto subsidiary, which went bankrupt and had to be bailed out by Renault. A small misstep for Lee Kun-hee in an otherwise very successful career. In the late 80s, he wanted Samsung to expand internationally. He had been selling phones in the protected Korean market at very high margins and never felt a need to expand to the highly competitive American and European markets. The first step in this transformation was to hire foreign employees and ship local employees out to learn. Lee sent his beloved niece, Mikey Lee, to the United States. She was in her 30s and had a flair for film and the arts, so her job was to find a marketer who could help build Samsung's brand and presence in America. She concluded that since Motorola controlled the mobile phone market and Sony controlled televisions, Samsung should enter the United States with microwave ovens instead. And it worked. Mikey was crucial in Samsung's internationalism in the 1990s onwards, notably winning a Samsung product placement contract for the hit movie The Matrix. But it wasn't all home runs being hit in America. Samsung had developed a bad habit of copying designs of others. They had a phone that looked like Motorola's, a remote control that looked like Sony's, and a car prototype like Nissan's. This scattered Samsung's identity across product lines, confusing customers as to what to expect. A culture change was needed. Samsung was to create its own distinctive design language. Lee Kun-hee's son, JY Lee, became involved in Samsung in the late 90s. JY, also known as Jay, was eager to participate in management because he needed a success story to prove himself. So he jumped into the internet sector, which was hot at the time, and started eSamsung in May 2000 and was investing in several Korean startups. But it was a giant dumpster fire. eSamsung went bust within a year. The broader Samsung Group ordered 9 affiliates to bid up the share price of eSamsung and relieve Jay of any financial damage. After these missteps, Jay Lee took on a loyal profile, one carefully managed by his close company aides. Around 2000, Samsung set up an R&D centre in Poland. This design centre would help Samsung enter the mobile phone business. That said, early versions were riddled with weak functionality and quality control issues. Samsung's phone business was struggling to say the least. But in 2004, Steve Jobs visited Samsung. He wanted them to supply Apple with NAND chips for the iPod. And 2 years later, he came to Korea, desperate for Samsung to help them supply a tailor-made chip for a new unknown product called the iPhone. With a deadline of just 5 months, an Apple engineer later admitted that the iPhone never would have been released in time had Samsung not got involved. But the launch of Android in 2008 provided a point of entry for Samsung to become a major phone manufacturer. In 2008, Samsung launched the Solstice line of devices, later renamed to Samsung Galaxy. And Samsung came up with a genius marketing campaign, positioning itself as a challenger brand against Apple, just like during the Coke vs Pepsi war of the 80s or the PC Mac war of the 90s. Many people identified with Samsung as the challenger brand, and the beauty of it was Samsung never relied much on innovation. Instead, they watched how disruptive products like the iPhone fared on the market, and then when the path to success was blindingly obvious, Samsung released their own version. Samsung's strength was to manufacture superior hardware faster than anyone else, much thanks to their strict top-down management system and a superior supply chain. Samsung's third generation had now taken over the business. Lee Kun-hee suffered a heart attack in 2014, and since then, his son, Jay Lee, has more or less been running the business. Jay is known as cautious and careful, maybe a result of blowing up eSamsung so early in his career. His mark on Samsung has so far been modest, and their focus is more on incremental improvements rather than anything revolutionary. What Jay Lee has done so far is reinforce Samsung's focus on creating world-class hardware, as he believes that hardware is Samsung's competitive advantage. He also sold off Samsung's corporate jets and got rid of its sluggish chemicals and weapons industries, with the proceeds being reinvested into Samsung's core smartphone business instead. But overall, the fact is that Samsung is a far different company to its Silicon Valley peers. It doesn't have the rebellious counterculture origins. Instead, it's an organisation with an almost military-style management system, conducting business as if it's issuing battle orders. That makes it even more crucial that the top leadership is steering the ship in the right direction. And then there's the broader issue around Korea's edge in a world where Chinese electronics manufacturing is becoming more competitive. Will Chinese competitors overtake Samsung in consumer electronics, just like Samsung overtook Sony 20 years ago? From this perspective, you could argue the story of Samsung is as much about Korea's competitive edge in manufacturing as it is about Samsung's own internal strategy. But today, Samsung is a sprawling conglomerate, with more than 50 companies in various industries such as shipbuilding, electronics, fashion, advertising, and even a hospital. And as mentioned at the start, Samsung and its affiliate companies produce around 1/5 of Korea's total exports, and their 2019 revenue represented 13% of South Korea's GDP. It's become such a large and integral part of the country that it's often hard to tell where the country ends and Samsung begins. But today, Samsung is at a crossroad. Jay Lee does not appear to be the visionary that his father was in his heydays, but perhaps he will mature into the role just like his father did. For Samsung, however, the key growth drivers are likely to be in the foundry, network equipment, and their biopharma businesses. Samsung has unveiled a plan to invest 450 trillion won over the next 5 years in strategic sectors such as semiconductors, biotech, and 6G telecommunications. 80% of this investment is earmarked for domestic spending, while the remaining amount will be invested overseas. Much of this total investment will go to the semiconductor division, which is expanding rapidly to compete with foundry leader TSMC and other big names such as Intel. And whilst Samsung's smartphone business is performing well now, it's unclear how Samsung can grow that business further without a revolutionary new product. But the most important questions for Samsung is about governance. Will the leadership transition from Lee Kun-hee to Jay Lee lead to a more innovative and dynamic organisation? Those questions are yet to be resolved. Enjoyed this video? Make sure to check out the source at Asian Century Stocks. I'm a happy paying subscriber and I cannot recommend his service enough. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, but until next time, have a good one.